My son's wedding was on a Saturday in June. 400 guests. A vineyard outside Charlottesville, the kind of venue that takes 2 years to book and costs more than I spent on my first house. My son Thomas is 31 years old and works in finance and had planned the wedding the way he plans everything, precisely, thoroughly, with contingencies for the contingencies. Everything went according to plan until the rehearsal dinner, when my wife's best friend sat down next to me and said, "I need to tell you something before tomorrow. I've been sitting on this for 11 years. I can't carry it into that church." Her name is Sandra. She and my wife Ellen have been friends since college, 34 years. She was the maid of honor at our wedding. She is Thomas's godmother. She said it quietly, leaning slightly toward me, while Ellen was across the room talking to Thomas and his fiancé's parents. She had a glass of wine she was not drinking. She looked like a person who had decided to do something difficult and was doing it before she lost her nerve. I put down my fork. She said, "This is the hardest thing I have ever had to do. I want you to know I tried not to. I tried to let it go. I have tried for 11 years. I said, "Sandra." She said, "I know about Portland." Before I tell you the rest, subscribe, because every story on this channel is real, it is raw, and it will stay with you. And drop a comment right now. Where in the world are you watching from? I read every single one. Now let me tell you. The room continued around us. My daughter-in-law-to-be was laughing at something. My son was shaking someone's hand. 400 people were arriving in 18 hours. I said, "What do you know about Portland?" She said, "Everything." My name is James. I am 63 years old. I have been married to Ellen for 36 years. And what Sandra told me at that rehearsal dinner in 11 minutes, while Ellen stood 20 feet away, was the thing I had spent 11 years believing had stayed buried. Let me go back, because the back matters. I was 52. Ellen and I had been married for 25 years. Thomas was 19, in his first year of college. Our daughter Claire was 16. Our life was what it looked like from the outside: stable, accomplished, unremarkable in the specific way that solid lives are unremarkable. We had built something real. I went to Portland for work. 3 days, a consulting project for a firm we had been trying to land for 2 years. The work went well. On the second evening, the client team took us to dinner and then to a bar, and I drank more than I should have, and I made a decision I had never made before in 25 years of marriage and have not made since. Her name was Dana. She worked for the client firm. We were both far from home. It lasted one night, and I ended it in the morning, with the specific shame of a person who has just understood exactly what they are capable of. I flew home. I told no one. I spent the following months in a private hell of my own construction, which I believe I deserved, and then I made the decision that I believe I should not have made. I decided that telling Ellen would be selfish, that it would transfer my guilt onto her and damage something that had been real and lasting for a quarter century for the sake of my own relief. I told myself this was protecting her. I know now that it was also protecting myself. I buried it. I thought I had buried it completely. What happened after Sandra told me she knew, and what I did about it, and what it cost. Sandra had found out 11 years ago, 6 months after Portland. She had run into Dana at a conference. Small world, same industry, wrong city. Dana had not known Sandra knew me. Dana had said something, innocently, that told Sandra everything. Sandra had sat on it for 11 years. She had told no one. She had spent 11 years being Ellen's best friend while carrying something about Ellen's husband that Ellen did not know. She told me this at the rehearsal dinner with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding something too heavy for too long. She said, "I love Ellen. I have loved her for 34 years, and I cannot watch my godson get married tomorrow while I am still carrying this. It is not fair to me, and it is not fair to her." I did not say anything for a moment. She said, "I am not asking you to do anything tonight. I am not going to tell her tonight. That would be wrong. Tonight is Thomas's night. But I am telling you now that I cannot keep this past tomorrow. After the wedding, after the honeymoon, when things have settled, you need to tell her, or I will." I said, "You've had this for 11 years. She said, "Yes, and it has cost me every single day. I should have told you sooner. I should have told her sooner. I kept thinking it would get easier to carry, and it never did." I said, "Why now? Why tonight?" She said, "Because Thomas is marrying a woman he loves tomorrow, in front of everyone who matters to him. Because he deserves to have parents who are honest with each other. Because I looked at that young man this week and thought about what he would think of his father if he knew, and I could not sit with that thought anymore." She picked up her wine. She took a sip. She looked at me steadily. She said, "I'll give you 6 weeks after the wedding. Then I tell her myself." She stood up. She smoothed her dress. She walked back across the room to Ellen with the specific composure of a woman who has just done something she could not have done if she had thought about it too long. I sat at that table for 7 minutes before I trusted myself to stand up. Thomas's wedding was beautiful. I want to say that clearly, because it was true and because it deserves to be said. The vineyard in June, the light coming through the vines, my son at the altar, looking at his wife the way you hope your children will look at someone. I watched it all with a specific quality of presence that I have never had at anything before or since. Completely there, completely attending to every moment, because I understood that I was watching something real, while carrying something that might change what real looked like in our family. I danced with Ellen at the reception. She was happy. She is beautiful when she is happy. She has always been beautiful, but there is a specific quality to it when she is fully present and glad. And she was both of those things. She leaned her head on my shoulder at the end of the song and said, "We did something right with him." I said, "Yes, we did." I said that with full knowledge of what I had to tell her. I told her on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the wedding. Thomas and his wife were on their honeymoon. Claire was in her own city, in her own life. Ellen and I were alone in the house the way we had been for years, the specific quiet of a house where the children have grown and gone. I told her at the kitchen table, with coffee, which is the most inadequate setting I can imagine for what I had to say, and which was also the only setting available because real things happen in ordinary places. I told her everything. I did not minimize. I did not manage. I did not construct a version that was easier to hear. I said, 11 years ago, I went to Portland for work. I said, I made a choice I had never made before and have not made since. I said, I told myself I was protecting you by not telling you, and I know now that I was also protecting myself, and I am sorry for both. She looked at me while I spoke. She did not look away. She did not say anything. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Sandra knows." It was not a question. I said, "Yes." She said, "How long?" I said, 11 years. She told me at the rehearsal dinner. Ellen said, "She carried that for 11 years?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And you've been carrying it for 11 years." I said, "Yes." She looked at her coffee, then she looked at me. She said, "I need you to leave the house for a few hours." I left. I drove to a parking lot near a park, and I sat there for 3 hours and thought about 36 years of a life I had built with a woman who deserved better than what I had done, and what it would cost to find out whether any of it was still standing. She called me at noon. She said, "Come home." I came home. What followed was the hardest 4 months of my life. I want to be honest about that without making it sound simpler than it was. Ellen is not a person who processes things quickly or quietly. She is a person who processes things completely, which means going all the way through, which means there were conversations that lasted hours and days when she did not speak to me, and nights when one of us slept in the other room, and mornings when I did not know, genuinely did not know, whether the marriage would survive it. She asked me things I had to answer honestly. She asked me about Dana, and I told her what I knew, which was not much. A name, a firm, a night 11 years ago that I had spent 11 years trying not to think about. She asked me why I had not told her, and I told her the honest version, which included the part where I was protecting myself. And I watched her absorb that, and I did not try to soften it. She asked me once whether there had been other times. I said no. She said, "I need to believe you." I said, "I know." She said, "Give me a reason." I said, 36 years. I said, "Not before Portland and not since." I said, "I do not expect you to simply believe that, and I will answer any question you have for as long as it takes." She said, "Okay." She did not say she believed me. She said, "Okay," which was what she had. Sandra came over in August. Ellen had called her. I was not present for that conversation, which lasted 4 hours and which Ellen has never fully described to me, and which I respect as belonging to the two of them. What I know is that Sandra left crying and called me from her car to say, "She's the strongest person I know." I said yes. Sandra said, "I should have told you sooner. I should have told her." I said yes. I said, "You did what you did, and it's done." Sandra said, "Does she forgive me?" I said, "You'll have to ask her." She did, eventually. My son Thomas does not know. This is a decision Ellen and I made together in September, after 4 months of the hardest work I have ever done. We decided that what happened between us is ours to carry, and that there is no version of telling Thomas that serves Thomas rather than ourselves. We may be wrong. We have discussed being wrong. We have decided together to live with possibly being wrong, rather than certainly causing harm. Claire does not know either, for the same reasons. What Ellen and I have now is not the same as what we had before. I want to be very clear about that. It is not the same, and it will not be the same, and I do not think it is honest to say otherwise. Something changed, and the change is permanent. What we also have is something that was built on what was left after the change, which is more than I had any right to expect. We have been honest with each other in the year since in a way that we were not honest in the 11 years before, and in a way that I am not certain we were ever fully honest. And the honesty is harder than the alternative, and also more solid under the feet. Ellen told me something in October, on our anniversary. We were having dinner at the same restaurant where I had proposed to her 37 years ago, which was her choice and which I understood was a deliberate choice. She said, "I want to tell you something." I said, "Okay." She said, "I don't know if I have fully forgiven you. I don't know if I will. But I know that I choose this. I choose to be here and to keep working on it and to see what it becomes. I need you to understand that this is a choice I am making, not a thing that simply happened." I said, "I understand." She said, "I need to hear you say it means something that I'm making that choice." I said, "It means everything." She said, "Good." We finished dinner. We drove home. We have been home since, doing the work of building something on the foundation of what survived, which is more than I deserved, and which I do not take for granted for a single day. Sandra and Ellen are still friends. It is different now. There is a knowledge between them that changes the texture of everything, and I think it always will. But they had 34 years, and they are not finished. Ellen told me once that what Sandra did at the rehearsal dinner was the bravest thing anyone had ever done for her. She said it cost their friendship something, and she is grateful for it anyway. I do not fully understand this, but I believe her. Thomas and his wife are expecting their first child in March. I will be a grandfather. I think about this with a specific quality of feeling that I cannot quite name. Something like, I have to deserve this. Something like, the work you do now is the foundation your grandchildren will stand on. I am trying to be worth the foundation. The vineyard in Charlottesville in June. My son at the altar. My wife's head on my shoulder at the end of the dance. All of it real. All of it carrying what it was carrying. All of it still standing. I want to tell you what those 4 months looked like from the inside, because I think people who have not been through something like this imagine it as either a clean break or a dramatic reconciliation, and it was neither. It was Tuesday mornings when she drank her coffee and did not look at me, which I understood and did not push against. It was dinners where we talked about ordinary things, Thomas's honeymoon, Claire's new job, what needed to be done in the garden, because the ordinary things were still there and still required tending, and tending them together was sometimes the only way we knew how to be in the same room. It was a Thursday in August when she said, out of nowhere, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely, "I keep thinking about all the times you came home from a work trip, and I was glad to see you, and I did not know what I was glad to see." I did not know what to say to that. I said, "I was always glad to come home." She said, "I know. That's the part I can't figure out." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "If you were glad to come home, why?" I said, "Because home was you." She said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "I need you to let me think about that." I let her think about it. I am still, in some ways, letting her think about it. It was a Sunday in September when she asked if I wanted to see a couples therapist. She said it the way she says things she has decided, not as a question exactly, but with room for my response. I said yes. She said, "I found someone. Her name is Dr. Patricia Walsh. I have already called her." I said, "Okay." She said, "I'm not doing this to save the marriage. I'm doing this to understand what I actually think about it." I said, "Okay." She said, "You should know that." I said, "I appreciate that you told me." Dr. Walsh is 60 years old and has the specific quality of directness that I associate with people who have spent decades watching couples try to talk around the things they need to say. She does not let us talk around things. This is uncomfortable and also the right approach. In our third session, she asked me, "What do you want this marriage to be?" I said, "I want it to be honest." She said, "It wasn't before. What changed?" I said, "I got caught." She said, "Is that the only thing that changed?" I thought about it for a long time. Then I said, "No." I said, "What changed is that I had to look at it directly. I had buried it so well that I had almost stopped carrying it. Getting caught meant I had to pick it back up and look at what it was." She said, "And what is it?" I said, "A thing I did that I cannot undo, and a choice I made afterward to keep it that I also cannot undo, but that I am responsible for." She nodded. She said, "Say that to Ellen." I said it to Ellen. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "That's the first time you've said that part, the choice to keep it." I said, "I know." She said, "Why now?" I said, "Because Dr. Walsh told me to, and because it's true, and because you deserve to hear the whole thing." She said, "Yes, I do." We continued. In October, on our anniversary, she made a reservation at the restaurant where I had proposed. She did not tell me until we arrived. I understood, standing on the sidewalk outside, that she had made a decision about something, and that the decision was to go back to the beginning and see what was still there. What was still there was 36 years of a real life, 2 children who became good people, a house that we had made into a home, the specific knowledge of each other that comes from decades of paying attention, her laugh, the way she takes her coffee, the way she holds a book, the exact quality of her silence when she is thinking versus when she is tired. I know all of these things. She knows the equivalent things about me. That knowledge is not nothing. It is, in fact, very much something. She said at that dinner that she was choosing to stay. She said it as a choice, which it was. I said, "I know what that costs." She said, "Yes, you do." She said, "I need you to live as though you know it, not just say it." I said, "I understand." She said, "Every day." I said, "Every day." We have been doing that, every day. Some days it is easier and some days it is not. And the days that are not easy are the true test, and I am trying to meet the test in a way I did not meet the test 11 years ago. My grandson or granddaughter arrives in March. Thomas called last week to tell us they have chosen a name. If it is a girl, Frances, after Ellen's mother who died 3 years ago. If it is a boy, James. He said it casually, in the middle of a longer conversation, and then he said, "Is that okay, Dad?" I said, "Yes, more than okay." He said, "We've been thinking about it for a while. Mom knows already. We told her last week." I said, "She didn't tell me." He said, "She wanted you to hear it from me." I said, "That sounds like her." He said, "Yeah." I told Ellen that night that I knew. She said, "I asked him to tell you himself." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you should hear your son say your name is good enough to carry forward." I said, "That's a generous thing for you to do." She said, "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for Thomas and for the baby." I said, "I know. Thank you anyway." She looked at me. She said, "You're welcome." This is what we have, not what we had. I have said that and I will not unsay it. Something different, built on what was left, which is more than I had any right to expect, and less than she deserved, and what we are both, together, deciding to make something of. The vineyard in Charlottesville, my son at the altar, a name carried forward. I am trying to be worth the name. There is something I have not said yet, and I want to say it because it is true, and because the true things are the only ones worth saying at this point. I was a coward for 11 years. Not in Portland. That was a different failure, a failure of commitment, a single night that I have spent years trying to understand and that I do not fully understand even now. But in the 11 years after Portland, I was a coward. I chose the easier thing every single day. I chose not to look. I chose not to tell. I arranged my life around a fact about myself that I did not want to face, and I called the arrangement protecting my family, and I was wrong. Ellen asked me once, in a session with Dr. Walsh, whether I had thought about telling her in those 11 years. I said yes. She said, "And?" I said, "And I talked myself out of it every time." She said, "What did you tell yourself?" I said, "That it would hurt you more than silence." Dr. Walsh said, "Was that true?" I said, "I don't know. I think it was partly true and partly convenient." Ellen said, "It was convenient." She said it without particular heat, just flatly, which was more accurate than heat would have been. I said, "Yes, it was convenient." She said, "I want you to understand something. The silence didn't protect me. The silence means I spent 11 years building a life with a person I didn't fully know. It means I made decisions about us, about our family, about what I trusted, based on incomplete information. The silence took something from me." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't think you fully know. I think you understand it in the abstract, but I want you to sit with the specific version, which is that I looked at you every day for 11 years and thought I knew who I was looking at. And I didn't. I sat with the specific version. I'm still sitting with it. Dr. Walsh asked me in October what I wanted to say to Ellen that I had not been able to say yet. I thought about it for a long time. Then I said, "I want to say that I am sorry for the silence more than I am sorry for Portland. Portland was one night. The silence was 11 years, and the silence was a choice I made every day." Ellen said nothing. I said, "I want to say that you were right to need the 6 weeks Sandra gave me. If Sandra hadn't been at that dinner, I don't know when I would have told you, and I should have told you years ago." Ellen said, "Yes." She said, "I know you believe that now." I said, "I believed it then, too. I just wasn't brave enough to act on it." She said, "I know." This was, I think, the most honest conversation I have ever had in my life. My daughter Claire visited in November. She knows nothing, as I said, and the decision to keep it from her stands. But she came for a long weekend, and on the second evening, we sat on the back porch after dinner, the three of us, and she said, "You two seem different." Ellen said, "Different how?" Claire said, "I don't know, more careful with each other, like you're paying more attention." Ellen said, "That's a good observation." Claire said, "Is everything okay?" Ellen looked at me. Then she looked at Claire and said, "We're doing some work. It's hard. We're okay." Claire looked between us. She said, "Okay." She said, "You'd tell me if it wasn't." It was not a question. Ellen said, "Yes, she would." We would. This is also part of the honesty we are building. The knowledge that there are things we are not telling our children, and the commitment that if the time comes when that changes, we will tell them together, and with the same directness we are finally learning to use with each other. Thomas calls every Sunday. He is attentive in the way new husbands are attentive, aware that there are more people in his life now to consider, learning the geometry of a larger family. He asks how we are. We tell him we are well. This is true. We are well, in the complicated way that people who are working hard on something are well. Tired and uncertain and more honest than we have been, and still standing. The baby arrives in March. We have booked flights. Ellen has already started thinking about what we will bring, which is the most Ellen thing I can imagine her doing, in which I find, watching her research onesies and muslin blankets and things I do not have names for, something close to overwhelming in its ordinariness. I stood in the doorway of her study last week, watching her take notes on a legal pad about infant sleep schedules, which she is approaching with the same thoroughness she brought to 30 years of being a high school administrator. And I thought, here she is. Here is the person I almost lost. Here is the person who decided, with full information, to stay. I thought, I do not deserve this. I thought, I'm going to spend the rest of my life being worth it anyway. She looked up and saw me in the doorway. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing, just watching." She said, "You've been doing that lately." I said, "Yes, I have been." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she said, "Come look at this. I found a sleep method that apparently works." I came and looked. The sleep method was elaborate and involved charts. I said, "This seems like a lot." She said, "Everything worth doing involves charts." I said, "That is the most you thing you have ever said." She said, "I have always used charts." I said, "I know." She said, "You're going to be a grandfather in March." I said, "Yes." She said, "You should take notes." I said, "I have very good notes." She said, "Let me see." I said, "They're in my head." She said, "James." I said, "I'm kidding, I'll make charts." She shook her head. She went back to her legal pad. I went back to the kitchen to make tea, and I thought about the vineyard in June, and Thomas at the altar, and Sandra leaning toward me with a glass of wine she was not drinking, and 4 months of the hardest work I have done, and the restaurant where I proposed 37 years ago, and a choice that is made every day. I made tea. I brought her a cup without asking. She took it without looking up from the charts. This is what we have. This is what we are building. It is enough. It is, on the good days, more than enough. I am trying to be worth the name my son chose to carry forward. That is the story I am keeping.